The year was 1962. Across the world, the Cold War simmered like a dormant volcano, visible only to those who dared to look closely enough. In the United States, the air was thick with optimism, but under the surface, fear brewed. Suburban families built fallout shelters beneath manicured lawns. Teachers led schoolchildren in duck and cover drills, preparing them for the day when the sky itself might fall. In Moscow, grim-faced leaders plotted over heavy maps and cold vodka, convinced that Western imperialism would strike first. The Second World War had ended less than 2 decades prior. Millions had died. Cities had been leveled into dust and ash. Yet, in the minds of many, the peace that followed felt uneasy, incomplete. 2 giants now loomed over the world: the United States of America and the Soviet Union, bound together by the fear of the very weapons they had unleashed, and divided by ideologies so different, so absolute, that compromise seemed impossible. In the years following the war, small nations became chess pieces on a vast global board: Asia, Africa, Latin America. Each revolution, each civil war, each regime change carried echoes of the greater conflict between capitalism and communism. Vietnam, Korea, Berlin, places once unknown to the average American or Russian schoolchild, became frontline trenches of an invisible war. By the early 1960s, both superpowers had amassed nuclear arsenals so vast that their use would mean the extinction of human life itself. The doctrine was grim: mutually assured destruction, a simple truth. If one side launched, the other would respond in full. No victory, no survivors, only silence. And yet, both sides continued stockpiling missiles, perfecting delivery systems, testing newer, deadlier bombs, all while speaking publicly of peace. 90 miles south of Florida, a revolution had stirred the waters. In 1959, Fidel Castro, a fiery young lawyer-turned-rebel, had overthrown the American-backed Batista government. At first, many in the United States celebrated. Surely, the overthrow of a dictator would lead to freedom. But celebration turned to alarm, as Castro nationalized American industries, seized property, and embraced communism openly. Cuba, once a tropical playground for wealthy Americans, now flew the red banner of the Soviet Union. By 1961, the United States had already attempted, and embarrassingly failed, to overthrow Castro at the Bay of Pigs. Paranoia gripped Washington. Was Cuba merely the first domino to fall? Would Latin America, Africa, Asia soon follow into the Soviet orbit? In secret meetings, plans were drawn. Assassination plots whispered through smoke-filled rooms. The CIA trained Cuban exiles. American generals sharpened their contingency plans. And always, above it all, hovered the terrible specter of nuclear exchange. Unknown to most, and invisible to the naked eye, Soviet ships had already begun their quiet journey across the Atlantic. Their cargo was death itself: medium-range nuclear missiles, capable of obliterating Washington, New York, and Miami within minutes. The world did not know it yet, but the countdown to humanity's most dangerous moment had already begun, and it would not be bombs or battles that decided the outcome. It would be words, choices made by tired men in dimly lit rooms, choices that teetered between sanity and annihilation. The Second World War was over, but the world it left behind was fractured, scarred beyond recognition. Cities like Warsaw, Stalingrad, Hiroshima had been reduced to hollow shells. Families torn apart, economies collapsed, nations left broken, angry, Hungary. In the wake of the carnage, two titans rose from the ashes. The United States of America, untouched by war at home, its economy booming, its military the strongest on earth, and the Soviet Union, battered and bloodied yet victorious, and burning with a grim determination to never again be caught vulnerable. They had fought as uneasy allies against Nazi Germany. But that friendship had always been a mask, thin, fragile, brittle. One believed in free markets, democracy, individual liberty. The other believed in collective ownership, centralized control, the supremacy of the state over the individual. Capitalism versus communism. Freedom versus equality. Two visions for humanity, both convinced of their righteousness, both willing to defend it by force. In the first fragile years after the war, old alliances crumbled quickly. The division of Germany, the Iron Curtain across Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, countries promised free elections, swallowed instead into the Soviet sphere. In response, the United States poured billions into rebuilding Western Europe through the Marshall Plan, hoping to create bulwarks against communist expansion. Tensions escalated. Trust eroded. By 1949, the world was no longer simply recovering from war. It was dividing into two camps, two empires, locked in a new kind of conflict. In 1949, the United States and its allies formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance pledging that an attack on one would be an attack on all. Less than a decade later, the Soviet Union responded with the Warsaw Pact, binding Eastern Europe into a mirror image of military readiness. The world was becoming two armed camps, glaring at each other across barbed wire, minefields, and satellite states. On August 29, 1949, a thunderclap shattered American confidence. Deep in the Kazakh desert, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, codenamed First Lightning. A mushroom cloud rose over the desert, and with it, the world changed again. The arms race had begun. Throughout the 1950s and early 60s, the numbers became staggering. At first, a handful of bombs, then hundreds, then thousands, each one more powerful than the last. Hydrogen bombs, the successors to Hiroshima, were tested in the oceans, in the Arctic, even high in the atmosphere. America tested Castle Bravo in 1954, a bomb so powerful it blinded observers over 200 miles away. The Soviets responded in 1961 with Tsar Bomba, the most powerful nuclear device ever detonated, a Utven megatons monster, 3,000 times stronger than the Hiroshima bomb. The logic behind this madness became doctrine, a terrifying philosophy, with a simple name: mutually assured destruction. If you launch your nukes, I launch mine, and everyone dies. It wasn't just a policy, it was a pact, a suicidal handshake between two enemies, designed to ensure neither would dare pull the trigger. Soon, the weapons weren't just getting stronger, they were getting faster. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, could travel halfway across the globe in under 30 minutes. Submarines patrolled silently beneath the oceans, carrying nuclear payloads capable of wiping out entire coastlines. Bombers flew 24-hour missions, always airborne, always ready. This was called the nuclear triad dash. Land-based missiles, submarine-based missiles, strategic bombers. redundancy to guarantee destruction. Even if one system failed, the others would still fire. Meanwhile, everyday life adapted to the new normal. In American classrooms, children practiced hiding under desks. Families were encouraged to build fallout shelters in their backyards, complete with canned food and radiation meters. Government PSAs told citizens that if they saw a flash in the sky, they should cover their eyes and get under something sturdy, as if hiding under a desk would save you from a 20-megaton detonation. But it wasn't about survival. It was about control, about pretending there was something we could do if the world suddenly ended. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, the same paranoia gripped Moscow. Soviet families didn't have fallout shelters, but they had drills. State propaganda emphasized American aggression. Every war game, every speech, every map showed the U.S. preparing for war. And to many in the Soviet leadership, it felt inevitable. They didn't trust Kennedy. Kennedy didn't trust Khrushchev. And the arsenals grew. Behind closed doors, generals and strategists drew up scenarios. How many bombs to destroy Moscow? How many civilian casualties were acceptable in retaliation? Analysts with clean suits and calm voices discussed mega-deaths, the deaths of millions, as if they were spreadsheets. The further from the battlefield you sat, the easier it was to talk about firestorms and mass extinction. And through it all, one terrible truth lingered. This delicate balance could be shattered in an instant. A radar malfunction, a misinterpreted drill, a trigger-happy commander, or a plane flying too far off course. That's all it would take to end everything. And then, a new variable entered the equation. Cuba, a tiny island, just a short boat ride from Miami, ready to host Soviet missiles, capable of reaching American soil in minutes. The logic of mutually assured destruction only worked if both sides had time to respond. The Cuban Missile Crisis shattered that comfort. Suddenly, nuclear death wasn't 30 minutes away. It was 5. Before the revolution, Cuba was a land of contrasts. Sparkling beaches lined with luxurious hotels, casinos spilling light into the Caribbean night. American tourists flooded Havana, sipping rum, dancing under neon signs, oblivious to what lay behind the stage. Yet behind the paradise, poverty festered. The rural poor lived in shacks with no electricity. Doctors were rare, schools rarer. Wealth flowed in from sugar and tobacco, but only to the hands of the few. And at the center of it all stood Fulgencio Batista, a military man turned dictator, backed quietly by American dollars and American interests. But not everyone stayed quiet. Among the whispers of dissent rose a young lawyer with a lion's voice. Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz. In 1953, Castro led a failed assault on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba. The attack was a disaster. Most of his men were killed. Fidel was captured. At his trial, he gave a speech that would echo for decades. Condemn me, it does not matter. History will absolve me. He was sentenced to prison, but released under amnesty 2 years later. And then he vanished. But not for long. In 1956, aboard a leaky boat called the Granma, Castro returned. With him, Che Guevara, an Argentine doctor turned revolutionary, and a band of 81 rebels. They were ambushed upon landing. Many died. The survivors, fewer than 20, fled into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. And from there, the revolution began. For 2 years, the rebels fought a guerrilla war against Batista's forces. Radio broadcasts from the mountains turned Fidel into a legend. Villagers fed them, students joined them, and the urban middle class, disillusioned with Batista's brutality, began to waver. By 1958, Batista's regime was crumbling. Corruption, torture, the people had had enough. The US, once his quiet partner, began backing away. On January 1st, 1959, Batista fled the country. His plane lifted off into the dark, taking with it millions in stolen cash. And as it did, Castro's forces rolled into Havana. It was a revolution without an official war, and to many Cubans, it felt like freedom had arrived. But Castro had bigger plans. In the months that followed, he seized foreign-owned lands. He nationalized oil refineries, sugar mills, and utilities, many of them American. He gave 6-hour speeches to cheering crowds. He met with Khrushchev. He grew a beard so thick it became legend. And quietly, he became a communist. By 1961, Cuba had officially aligned with the Soviet Union. To the United States, this was unacceptable. Communism had crossed the Western Hemisphere. That same year, President Eisenhower authorized the CIA to train Cuban exiles for a secret invasion. When Kennedy took office, he inherited the plan. And in April 1961, the mission launched, the Bay of Pigs. It was a disaster, poorly coordinated, under-resourced. The exiles landed and were immediately surrounded. Castro's forces crushed them in days. Over 1,000 were captured. The world watched as the United States humiliated itself. But the invasion had consequences. Castro now knew America wanted him dead, and Khrushchev saw an opportunity. A small island 90 miles from Florida. Angry, armed, communist, and under threat. If the Soviet Union could protect Cuba and station weapons there, it would change the balance of power overnight. And so, the missiles began to move, silently, carefully, beneath the decks of freighters, toward Havana, toward history, toward the brink. On August 6, 1945, Hiroshima disappeared beneath a blinding flash. The atomic age had arrived. The United States had demonstrated a weapon so devastating, it redefined war itself. But it wouldn't be alone for long. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. A new arms race began, one not of soldiers and tanks, but of scientists and warheads. Each side raced to build more, bigger, faster. By the early 1950s, atomic bombs were old news. Hydrogen bombs, fusion-based weapons 1,000 times more powerful, became the new standard. Entire atolls vanished in American tests. Shock waves rattled windows hundreds of miles away. Radiation drifted across oceans. And the Soviets? They weren't far behind. In 1961, they tested the Tsar Bomba, a 50-megaton monster, the largest nuclear explosion in human history. Windows shattered 500 miles away. The flash could be seen from space, but power wasn't enough. Speed became the obsession. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, could deliver death from continent to continent in under 30 minutes. Submarines prowled silently under the oceans. Each carried dozens of nuclear missiles, hidden, mobile, undetectable. Strategic bombers circled the skies on constant rotation. One order, and they'd strike. Together, these three systems, ICBMs, subs, and bombers, became known as the nuclear triad. Redundancy, insurance. If one system was destroyed, the others would still launch. This doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, wasn't a theory, it was policy. Each side pointed thousands of warheads at the other. Each knew that to fire first was to die second. Paranoia became strategy. Fear became stability. And the world lived under a balance of terror. The math was cold. How many megadeaths? How many bombs to eliminate Moscow? How many civilian casualties were acceptable in a limited exchange? It was a game played by calm men in crisp suits, planning for the end of the world. In schools, children hid under desks. In homes, families stocked canned food and Geiger counters. In bunkers, officers waited for launch codes. And still, the weapons came. More accurate, more lethal, more silent. By 1962, the United States had thousands of nuclear warheads. The Soviet Union, not as many, but enough. But Moscow had a problem. Their ICBMs were fewer, less accurate, easier to spot. American missiles in Europe and Turkey could strike them in minutes. And so, they looked to Cuba. A chance to close the gap. A chance to level the playing field. A chance to put America in the crosshairs. The arms race was no longer theoretical, it was moving into position. The United States had already stationed nuclear weapons uncomfortably close to Soviet borders. 15 Jupiter missiles, installed in Turkey, each one capable of delivering a 1.4 megaton nuclear warhead deep into the Soviet heartland, including Moscow, in under 10 minutes. To the American public, these missiles were barely mentioned. To American leadership, they were just part of the strategic balance. But to the Kremlin, they were a provocation, a direct threat, an intolerable double standard. Khrushchev saw it clearly. The United States could ring the Soviet Union with weapons in Turkey, in Italy, in West Germany. But the moment the USSR attempted to place missiles in the Western Hemisphere, the world cried foul. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on the Soviet leadership. And so, a plan began to form. A bold plan. If the Americans could put missiles on their doorstep, the Soviets would do the same. But not in Europe, in the Caribbean, 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The Soviets called it Operation Anadyr, named after a freezing region in Siberia to throw off Western intelligence. The operation's goal? To secretly ship medium-range and intermediate-range nuclear missiles into Cuba, to build launch sites, to train Cuban personnel, to create a deterrent that would neutralize the threat of an American invasion of the island. But it wasn't just about defense. Khrushchev knew he was playing a dangerous game, but one he believed could shift the global balance of power. Cuba wasn't just about solidarity, it was about leverage. The missiles being sent were no props. The R-12 Divina and R-14 Chusovaya, NATO codenamed SS-4 and SS-5 respectively. Soviet-built, nuclear-tipped, with ranges between 1,000 and 2,500 kilometers. Enough to reach most major U.S. cities: Chicago, Washington, New York, Dallas. If they became operational, the Soviets would gain a first strike capability they had never had before. The plan required secrecy. The missiles were dismantled and loaded into cargo ships. Alongside them, launch equipment, radar systems, and over 40,000 Soviet troops, all under the guise of agricultural support. Crews were instructed not to wear uniforms. Some cargo was disguised as farm equipment or humanitarian supplies. Meanwhile, the Americans, though suspicious, did not act. Even as U.S. intelligence noticed increased Soviet activity in Cuba, no one guessed the scale of what was underway. By the end of September 1962, the first missiles were arriving, hidden in crates, driven down dusty roads, unpacked, and slowly assembled under camouflage nets and palm trees. The construction of launch sites began immediately. Concrete was poured, fueling stations erected, mobile launchers brought in. From above, they looked like farm plots, but to those with the right lenses, they were death waiting to be activated. And still, Washington remained unaware until a single flight changed everything. October 14th, a U-2 spy plane flew over western Cuba and captured the images that would pull the world to the edge of nuclear war. October 14th, 1962. It started like any other day. Major Richard Heiser climbed into the cockpit of his U-2 reconnaissance aircraft at Laughlin Air Force Base in Texas. His mission? Fly over western Cuba, take high-altitude photos, return home. It wasn't his first time, but this flight would be historic. At 72,000 feet, invisible to radar and nearly untouchable by Cuban air defenses, the U-2's cameras clicked away. They captured detailed black-and-white images of remote fields, odd structures, construction equipment. Nothing looked out of place until it did. Rows of concrete pads, long, narrow shapes resembling missile launchers, silos in construction, fueling stations, camouflage tents, and most telling of all, long cylindrical objects nearly 70 feet in length. The photos were processed, then classified, then rushed to Washington. On the morning of October 16th, President John F. Kennedy was briefed. The assessment: the Soviets were building medium-range ballistic missile launch sites on Cuban soil. The missile type was identified as the SS-4 Sandal, or a 12 Dvina. Estimated range 2,000 kilometers, capable of hitting Washington, New York, Atlanta, Dallas, and nearly all of the eastern and southern United States. Worse, the sites were not under construction. They were nearly complete. Some could be operational within a week. Kennedy sat in silence. His advisors waited. The world was just one decision away from chaos. The president formed an elite group, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM. The committee included Vice President Lyndon Johnson, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, CIA Director John McCone, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, and a handful of others. They met in secret. No press briefings, no leaks. Just 12 men in a room, staring down Armageddon. Each brought a different idea. Some wanted an immediate airstrike, bomb the sites before the missiles became operational. Others pushed for a full invasion. Remove Castro once and for all. Some advised a more measured response, a naval blockade, to stop further missiles from arriving. But there was no perfect option. An airstrike might miss some missiles. An invasion could spark a Soviet counterattack in Berlin or Turkey. A blockade risked looking weak, or worse, failing. And all the while, Soviet ships were still en route to Cuba, carrying more missiles, more warheads, more troops. The president faced a terrifying reality. Every hour mattered. The longer he waited, the closer those missiles came to becoming active. The sooner he acted, the higher the risk of triggering a war. And all the while, the American public had no idea. Children went to school, families mowed lawns, baseball was played, and the world edged closer to the brink. On October 18th, Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko visited the White House. Kennedy, now fully aware of the missiles, asked directly whether the Soviets were installing offensive weapons in Cuba. Gromyko lied. He claimed Soviet assistance to Cuba was purely defensive, to protect the island from imperialist threats. Kennedy didn't argue. He didn't reveal what he knew. He just listened, took notes, and waited. 2 days later, on October 20th, the president made his decision. The United States would initiate a naval quarantine. A line would be drawn. Any ship carrying offensive weapons to Cuba would be stopped, and the American people, finally, would be told. The countdown had begun. October 22nd, 1962. President John F. Kennedy stepped in front of television cameras. The room was silent. The nation held its breath. And then, in his calm, precise voice, he revealed the unthinkable. The Soviet Union has placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. He explained that the weapons posed a direct threat to the security of the Western Hemisphere, that these missiles could strike most major cities in the United States in under 5 minutes, that the United States would not tolerate it. And so, a quarantine was declared. Not a blockade, a word associated with war, but a line, nonetheless. A naval perimeter would surround the island of Cuba. Any ship carrying offensive weapons would be intercepted, turned back, or, if necessary, boarded. This was not an act of war. Yet everyone understood what it meant. Within hours, the U.S. military began to mobilize. Aircraft carriers deployed to the Atlantic. B-52 bombers armed with nuclear payloads flew continuous loops. Submarines took position. On October 24th, the quarantine zone went live. American destroyers waited in formation. And then, Soviet ships appeared on the horizon. Missile freighters, supply vessels, cargo ships. Everyone held their breath. Would they stop? Would they challenge the blockade? At the last moment, they slowed, turned, retreated. But the crisis wasn't over. A handful of Soviet vessels still sailed toward Cuba. One freighter, the Grozny, continued without delay. American ships tracked it, monitored, prepared. Meanwhile, beneath the ocean's surface, things were even more dangerous. 4 Soviet submarines, armed with nuclear-tipped torpedoes, lurked beneath the waves. American destroyers dropped practice depth charges, signals meant to force submarines to surface. But one sub, B-59, mistook the charges for an attack. Its commander, believing war had begun, ordered the launch of a nuclear torpedo. Protocol required the agreement of 3 officers. 2 said yes, 1 said no. His name was Vasily Arkhipov. And in that moment, he saved the world. Back on land, tension mounted. Soviet troops in Cuba accelerated missile construction. The Americans readied for airstrikes. A U-2 pilot accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace in Alaska. Fighter jets scrambled. For 13 days, the world teetered, each move calculated, each hour critical. One wrong signal, one misinterpreted action, and the missiles would fly. October 27th, 1962. History would remember it as Black Saturday, the single most dangerous day in human history, the day the world came closest to nuclear war. Tensions were already unbearable. The U.S. military was on full alert. Over 180,000 troops were prepared to invade Cuba. B-52 bombers, armed with nuclear weapons, circled in the sky. Soviet missile sites in Cuba were nearing completion. And then, it happened. A U-2 reconnaissance plane, piloted by Major Rudolf Anderson, flew over eastern Cuba. He never returned. The Soviets had fired a S-2 surface-to-air missile and hit their mark. Major Anderson was dead. He became the first and only combat casualty of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In Washington, the military demanded immediate retaliation. Pentagon officials pushed for airstrikes, but President Kennedy resisted. He knew a military response could lead to a full-scale nuclear exchange. In private, he was furious. In public, composed. In that same moment, below the surface of the Atlantic, another crisis was unfolding. The U.S. Navy had been tracking a Soviet submarine, B-59. Unaware that the sub carried a nuclear torpedo, the Americans dropped practice depth charges, attempting to force the sub to surface. But inside B-59, conditions were dire. The crew hadn't heard from Moscow in days. Temperatures soared. CO levels rose. They believed war had already begun. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, ordered the nuclear torpedo to be armed. Protocol required the agreement of 3 officers. 2 said yes, but the third, Vasily Arkhipov, said no. He convinced the captain to surface, to wait, to hold fire. His refusal stopped a nuclear launch. One man, under unbearable pressure, made a choice that saved humanity. But the tension didn't stop there. That evening, the U.S. received 2 letters from Moscow. The first, calm and conciliatory. Khrushchev offered to remove the missiles in exchange for a public U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba. The second, harsher, demanding that the U.S. also remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. ExComm debated. Which letter was real? Which represented Khrushchev's true position? Kennedy made a bold choice. He responded only to the first letter. Agreed publicly to the no invasion pledge. Privately, Robert Kennedy met with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. He offered a deal. The United States would remove its missiles from Turkey, but not immediately and not publicly. It was risky, but it was the only option left. The world now waited for Khrushchev's reply. One word could change history. And somewhere, in bunkers, on submarines, in missile silos, fingers hovered over buttons, waiting. October 28th, 1962. The final message arrived. Broadcast by Radio Moscow, it was short, clear, and decisive. Nikita Khrushchev had made his choice. He would withdraw the Soviet missiles from Cuba. The immediate danger was over. The world exhaled. In Washington, Kennedy's team read the message with cautious relief. There was no grand announcement, no formal treaty, just a public statement from the Soviet premier. And behind it, a quiet, unspoken agreement. The United States would not invade Cuba, and in return, the Soviets would remove their nuclear missiles, launchers, and related equipment. Over the following weeks, American reconnaissance flights confirmed the dismantling. The missiles were loaded onto Soviet ships, turned around, and sailed back across the Atlantic. But the full story wasn't revealed until much later. Privately and crucially, the US also agreed to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Not immediately, and not publicly. The agreement was to do so quietly, within a few months, and not appear as part of the deal. To the outside world, it looked like a Soviet retreat, but inside diplomatic circles, the reality was far more complex. Both leaders had stepped back. Both had given ground. And both had preserved face. The most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War had ended. Not in fire, but in words. But no one celebrated. There were no parades, no cheers in the streets, just silence, reflection, and for those in the know, lingering fear. What if Khrushchev hadn't backed down? What if Kennedy had ordered that airstrike? What if the blockade had failed? What if Vasily Arkhipov hadn't said no? The questions hung heavy, and the lessons were immediate. The hotline between Washington and Moscow was established. A direct line, red, symbolic, to prevent miscommunication. In the months and years that followed, both nations would sign nuclear treaties. The Limited Test, Ban Treaty, eventually the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But those came later. In October 1962, what mattered was survival. And survival had prevailed. Barely. The missiles were gone. But the shadow remained. The Cuban Missile Crisis didn't end the Cold War. It transformed it. In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev spun the outcome as a victory. He had protected a socialist ally. He had extracted a no-invasion pledge from the United States. But within the Soviet leadership, doubts began to grow. Khrushchev had acted unilaterally, secretly, recklessly. Some saw the withdrawal as weakness, as capitulation. 2 years later, in 1964, he was removed from power, quietly, internally, without fanfare. In Washington, President Kennedy was praised. He had stared down the Soviets, avoided war, preserved peace. But he was changed. The crisis aged him. He emerged more skeptical of military advice, more cautious, more determined to avoid another confrontation like it. Within months, he began work on what would become the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Signed in 1963, it banned nuclear tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. It was the first major arms control agreement of the Cold War, but not the last. The crisis also led to the establishment of the Washington-Moscow hotline, a direct communication line, not red, as legend often claims, but teletype, fast, director, essential. It was built to ensure that never again would miscommunication bring the world to the edge. But the Cold War continued. The arms race never stopped. More missiles were built. More submarines launched. New strategies developed. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction remained intact. And Cuba? Fidel Castro stayed in power for decades, isolated, defiant, unshaken. He had survived the Bay of Pigs, survived the missile crisis, survived countless assassination attempts. He remained a symbol, both of resistance and repression. For the American public, the memory of October 1962 faded slowly, but within the halls of power, it never left. Generals, diplomats, analysts, all studied those 13 days. They dissected every cable, every command, every speech, because they knew what happened in those days nearly changed everything. The world had come within inches of catastrophe, not because of hatred, but because of fear, misjudgment, ego, ambition, and yet it had stepped back. Barely. The Cuban Missile Crisis became a cautionary tale, a reminder that diplomacy can succeed where weapons fail, that restraint can be stronger than retaliation, and that even in the darkest moments, a different path is always possible. What if it had gone the other way? What if Kennedy had ordered airstrikes? What if the missiles in Cuba had become operational before discovery? What if Vasily Arkhipov had nodded yes? These are not idle questions. They are the ghost stories of the 20th century. And they are terrifying. Let's imagine the alternate path. An American airstrike begins on October 22nd. It destroys several missile sites, but not all. The Soviets, already on edge, interpret it as the beginning of a full invasion. Cuban and Soviet forces respond. Anti-aircraft batteries open fire. A second U-2 is shot down. American pilots are killed. The U.S. Navy enforces the blockade. A Soviet ship refuses to stop. Shots are fired. A Soviet submarine, thinking war has begun, launches its nuclear torpedo. A U.S. aircraft carrier is vaporized. Washington, believing this was a coordinated Soviet attack, responds. Nuclear bombers are launched. Missiles fired from Europe. The Soviet Union retaliates. Missiles from Cuba fly. New York, Washington, Chicago, Atlanta, gone. American ICBMs hit Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev. The blast radius alone kills millions. Nuclear winter begins within weeks. Temperatures drop, crops fail, supply chains collapse. Civilization, as we know it, unravels, all in a matter of days. And for what? Misjudgments, mistrust, moments. These aren't dramatic flourishes. They were real possibilities. The United States came closer to nuclear war than any point before or since. The fate of the world depended on a U-2 pilot flying straight, a Soviet naval officer saying no, a president choosing patience over pride, and a premier choosing politics over apocalypse. The Cuban Missile Crisis is not just history, it is a warning. Because today, we still live in a world with thousands of nuclear weapons, still ruled by ego, still vulnerable to misunderstanding. The crisis reminds us that restraint is not weakness, dialogue is not surrender, and sometimes the greatest power a leader can show is the power not to act, to step back, to listen, to wait. In October 1962, that power saved us. May we never forget how close we came and how lucky we are to be able to imagine what if.